Before dawn on March 1st, 1869, Italian columns moved through the dark mountains near Adwa in northern Ethiopia. Officers expected to seize the heights before Emperor Menelik II could react. Their orders looked clear on paper. Their maps were not. The paths twisted between ridges, ravines, and villages the Italians barely understood. By first light, the columns that were supposed to support one another had drifted apart. Somewhere beyond them, the Ethiopian camp was already stirring. Menelik had waited for this moment, but he had not stumbled into it. For years, he had watched Italy push inland from Eritrea, watched Europe divide Africa at conference tables, and watched foreign diplomats underestimate his state. Now the test had arrived. If Italy won, Ethiopia would be reduced to a protectorate. If Ethiopia won, the claim that African states could not survive modern imperial war would be broken in front of the world. The road to Adwa began not with a battle, but with a treaty. On May 2, 1889, Menelik, then ruler of Shewa and soon emperor, signed the Treaty of Wuchale with Italy. Italy received territory in the north and promised money, weapons, and recognition. But Article 17 carried the poison. In the Amharic version, Menelik could use Italy in dealings with foreign powers. In the Italian version, he was required to do so. Rome used that wording to announce that Ethiopia had accepted Italian protection. Menelik rejected the claim. Empress Taytu Betul, his wife and political partner, understood the danger with unusual clarity. She pressed for resistance to any language that made Ethiopia dependent on Italy. At court, the dispute was not a technicality. It was the difference between diplomacy and surrender. In 1893, Menelik formally denounced the treaty. The words on the page had become a line no ruler could cross and remain sovereign. Italy expected pressure to work. It had already built the colony of Eritrea along the Red Sea coast. Its leaders believed Ethiopia would fracture under strain, as rival nobles chose private survival over national defense. Menelik answered with a different calculation. He had spent years expanding imperial authority, building roads of loyalty through marriage, negotiation, conquest, and patronage. When war approached, he called on regional rulers, priests, nobles, and peasant soldiers from across the empire. Modernization was part of the same strategy. Menelik did not reject the outside world. He bought from it. Ethiopian agents acquired rifles and artillery through commercial networks that included French, Russian, Italian, and other channels. Earlier agreements had brought muskets and cannon. Later purchases added Remington, Cross, and Burden rifles to older weapons already in circulation. European observers often imagined Ethiopia as isolated, but Menelik treated global rivalry as an arsenal. Powers that distrusted one another could still sell arms to an African emperor if the price and politics suited them. This did not turn Ethiopia into a European army. It remained a force built around provincial levies, noble command, religious legitimacy, and deep local knowledge. But that was the point. Menelik combined older systems of mobilization with newer weapons and diplomatic caution. He did not need to copy Europe completely. He needed enough firepower, enough unity, and enough time to make the invasion costly. The first major Italian moves seemed promising to Rome. In 1895, Italian forces advanced beyond Eritrea. They occupied positions in Tigray and expected Ethiopian resistance to collapse. Instead, Menelik gathered a huge army and moved north. Estimates vary, but Ethiopian forces likely exceeded 100,000, including large numbers armed with modern rifles. Alongside Menelik stood commanders such as Ras Alula, Ras Makonnen, Ras Mikhail, Ras Mengesha Yohannes, and Empress Taytu herself, whose presence helped bind politics, morale, and strategy. The Italian army under General Oreste Baratieri was smaller, roughly 17,000 to 20,000 men, including Italian troops and Eritrean askari. It was disciplined and armed with modern rifles and artillery, but it was stretched across hard country. Supplies were thin, food was scarce, pack animals died or failed. Morale suffered. Rome wanted action, especially Prime Minister Francesco Crispi, who feared a retreat would shame Italy. Baratieri knew the risks. He faced a force much larger than his own, on terrain he did not control, with maps that simplified mountains into guesses. By late February 1896, both armies were near Adwa. Menelik's forces had endured their own shortages, and he considered withdrawing to find supplies. That possibility pushed Italian commanders toward attack. On the night of February 29th, Baratieri ordered an advance meant to place his brigades on strong positions before dawn. The plan required coordination in dark, across broken ground. Brigades under Matteo Albertone, Giuseppe Arimondi, Vittorio da Bormida, and Giuseppe Elena were supposed to move in relation to one another. Instead, distance, faulty maps, and confusion opened gaps. Albertone's brigade, made up largely of Eritrean Askari, moved too far forward and became isolated near Enda Kitane Meret. Ethiopian scouts and local informants detected the movement. Menelik's command system, often dismissed by outsiders as loose, responded with speed. Messengers moved through the hills. Commanders recognized that the Italians had handed them a chance to destroy the enemy in pieces. The battle began as Albertone's men came under heavy pressure. Ethiopian forces surged against them from the surrounding heights. The Askari fought hard, but they were exposed. Italian support did not arrive in time because the other brigades were not where the plan required them to be. The geography had broken the battle before the main armies fully understood it. As Albertone's line crumbled, Arimondi's brigade moved into crisis. Ethiopian forces, now gathering in greater numbers, struck toward the center. Menelik's commanders used the terrain not as scenery, but as a weapon. Ridges hid movement. Heights multiplied fire. Valleys trapped units that could not see one another. What the Italians had imagined as a march to commanding ground became a series of separate fights against an army that knew where to concentrate. Da Bormida's brigade drifted away from the center, seeking position but losing contact. This separation became fatal. Ethiopian units attacked in difficult ground, cutting it off from support. Da Bormida was killed. Arimondi also died in the fighting. Albertone was captured. Elena's reserve could not repair a battle that had already shattered into fragments. It also exposed a weakness at the heart of colonial thinking. Italian officers had counted rifles, roads, and ranks, but they had misread politics. They mistook Ethiopian negotiation for submission, regional diversity for weakness, and patience for fear. At Adwa, those errors became losses measured in bodies and broken command. The Ethiopian victory was not a simple rush of numbers against rifles. Numbers mattered, but so did timing, intelligence, and command. Menelik and Taytu had chosen to fight where Ethiopian forces could use mass without surrendering control. Their commanders identified isolated Italian units and struck them before they could combine. Ethiopian soldiers carried modern rifles, but they also carried the confidence of defending home ground under leaders they recognized. The Italian telegraph could send messages across empire, but in the Adwa Mountains, local information moved faster than imperial assumption. By midday, the Italian army was in retreat. The defeat was devastating. Thousands of Italians and Eritrean soldiers were killed, wounded, or captured. Exact figures differ across accounts, but Italy lost a large portion of its field force. Ethiopian losses were also heavy, yet the result was unmistakable. A European army had invaded an African empire and had been beaten in open battle. The shock spread quickly. In Italy, the defeat damaged the government and humiliated a young kingdom that had wanted imperial prestige. Crispi resigned within weeks. Across Europe, Adwa forced diplomats and newspapers to take Ethiopia seriously. Menelik did not press blindly into Eritrea. He understood that victory had to be converted into recognition, not exhausted in revenge. On October 26, 1896, Italy and Ethiopia signed the Treaty of Addis Ababa. Italy abandoned the Protectorate claim and recognized Ethiopia's independence. The Treaty of Wuchale was cancelled. Eritrea remained under Italian rule, with borders addressed in later agreements, but Ethiopia had preserved its sovereignty at a moment when most of Africa was being placed under European flags. The meaning of Adwa reached far beyond the battlefield. For Ethiopians, it confirmed the authority of Menelik's state and gave the empire time to strengthen its institutions, borders, and international relations. For Africans under colonial rule, and for people of African descent abroad, it became proof that European conquest was not destiny. Adwa did not end colonialism. It did not erase the violence within Ethiopia's own imperial expansion, but it gave the modern world a rare image: an African army defeating a European invader and forcing that defeat into treaty law. That image carried into the 20th century. Ethiopia became a symbol of Pan-African thought, a sovereign African state that could host diplomacy while much of the continent fought for self-rule. In 1963, independent African states gathered in Addis Ababa to create the Organization of African Unity, the predecessor of the African Union. The connection was not accidental. Ethiopia's capital carried the memory of a state that had survived when survival had seemed impossible. Adwa remains powerful because it was not a miracle. It was the result of choices made before the rifles opened fire. Menelik bought weapons while rivals underestimated him. Taytu challenged the language of dependency before it hardened into foreign control. Ethiopian leaders turned regional power into collective defense. Soldiers crossed mountains to defend a political idea larger than any single province. Italy marched into Adwa, believing modern empire could impose reality by treaty, map, and force. Ethiopia answered with diplomacy, preparation, and unity. On those ridges in 1896, the myth of automatic European victory collapsed. What remained was a harder lesson: that sovereignty survives when a people understand the threat clearly, adapt without surrendering themselves, and meet an empire not as victims waiting for history, but as makers of it.